So I am very pleased to introduce to you Jenan El-Hifnawi. I hopefully got her name right. Yay, she's giving me a thumbs up. Jenan is a Maryland native and a local ecology enthusiast. After graduating from the University of Maryland with a bachelor's degree in biology, she was awarded a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship to fund her master's degree at the University of Maryland. She's now working towards this degree, exploring the impacts of the Ice Age on the evolution of various South American bee species. She's also the coordinator of the program we're going to hear about tonight called Ask a Bumble Bee, which a couple years ago I kind of stumbled into, and it's been really fun to watch that journey and see that program actually start from really nothing to where she is today, reporting on some of these really cool results that might help some of us choose which plants to use in our garden maybe, and actually just honing your observation skills, which is really fun. I am definitely more aware of my bumblebee species now because of that program. So thank you, Jenan. Please join us here, and we're looking forward to hearing this.
Well, thank you so much for having me and introducing me and everything. It's really exciting to be here. I think I know a lot less about plants than most of you, so I'm excited to hopefully get some feedback. And yeah, I think I have a very wise crowd that I'm hoping you'll point some things out and I can learn something today. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about Ask a Bumble Bee. It is a survey project trying to see what flowers bumblebees like. And I do this under Sam Droege at the USGS Fish and Wildlife Service joint bee monitoring lab. Okay, so here's a little outline of what we'll be talking about. I'm going to introduce myself and the program, and then spend some time talking about the basics of the program and some of our results. And then, because this program was my first foray into the bee world, and then now I'm doing a master's in bees, I hope that sharing some bee facts will spread the plant enthusiasm, although I'm sure a lot of people in this audience already are into bees. And then I have fun finds on here, but after running through, I'm a little over, so we'll see. I think that hopefully I can sprinkle some fun things to look out for that are probably in your gardens, but I don't think we'll actually have a whole section of that. Okay, sorry, I have transition slides. Thank you. Okay, so I coordinate the Ask a Bumble Bee program. I've been doing this since 2021. We actually, I'm very grateful to the Maryland Native Plant Society for our grant, because since 2021, that has been we had some funding from the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2021, and since then, it's been you guys and volunteering. So thank you. Yeah, as I was saying, I stumbled upon the Bee Lab because I just wanted to do some ecology work, as I think many of you probably feel similarly. And then I fell in love with the Bee Lab and this program, and I am now doing a master's in the Espindola Lab at the University of Maryland. And as Lauren said, I'm studying the effects of the Ice Age on 4 bee species, one of which is this bumblebee, the giant Patagonian bumblebee, Bombus dalbomii. Yeah, and I'm trying to see how the Ice Age sort of would affect their diversification, and we do that broadly by seeing like what niches they like now and where that niche would have existed since the Ice Age, and sort of modeling where they could have migrated and sort of hidden out from giant ice swaths during that period. So pretty different from this program, but ask me questions if you're interested. So this is a box of some sadly late bees, but these are more of my giant Patagonian bumblebees, and these I got from the American Museum of Natural History. And I include it because I think it's sort of a nice segue into why the program and being non-lethal is so great. But also, I've put a star next to these 2 bumblebees because I think those are about the size of a large common eastern bumblebee or 2-spotted, the ones that we see around here. So like these ones, they're huge. It's crazy. But these are only native to South America, so we won't be seeing them here, but I thought I would share because I find them exciting. So why bumblebees for this project? A lot of it is because they are large and site identifiable. So as in the last slide, there were a lot of dead bees. Most entomology research is lethal. It's really hard to identify bugs without killing them, unfortunately. But as you can kind of see in this picture, bumblebees are big, and you can even get some species level IDs based on coloration alone. So we can get pretty solid data from citizen scientists without anybody having to kill bees, and it can be fairly reliable just out in the field. And they're also very cute and fuzzy. People say flying teddy bears. So we also study carpenter bees floral preference in this program. And part of that is because, as you might notice, they look pretty similar to bumblebees. So we don't want people to be mixing them up, and it's sort of extra like, hey, watch out for these. But also they are cool pollinators, and I have some carpenter bee facts because I know they have some enemies, and I hope to sell them a little bit more to people. In terms of them being very similar looking to bumblebees, the big difference that people always say is they have a shiny abdomen or a shiny hiney, people say, and bumblebees have hairy abdomens. Okay, so a little bit more about the program. We are trying to see which flowers bumblebees like the most. We are trying to do this because, surprisingly, we don't really know this question already. It seems like we should know what plants bumblebees like because they're such a popular insect and so common. But a lot of the existing data on these insects looks at what plants they are visiting rather than what plants are available, which they're not visiting. So maybe you'll have a garden of just black-eyed Susans and you'll see bumblebees on them and say, bumblebees like black-eyed Susans. But if you have a garden of black-eyed Susan and mountain mint and bee balm, maybe they won't be on the black-eyed Susan. So it's important to consider what else was available that they're choosing not to visit. So we want to do this by getting as much data as possible. So we try to keep our protocol very accessible to anybody, whether or not you have experience with bees. All you have to do is you pick any area. So you can do your garden or somewhere urban or the middle of a field, wherever you like. I've done some in Georgetown, like some in the middle fields, and everywhere works. So you wander around wherever you've chosen for a half hour. There's no transects. You could like just weave around. If you don't want to include something in your survey area, you don't have to walk there. If you do want something, you walk over to it. So while you're wandering, you'll record every flower species that you pass. And if you know how to identify them yourself, that's great. If not, we recommend using like Seek or something because we have a botanist review the pictures of all of your plants by the end. So you'll snap a picture of each plant species, write down the ID you believe it is, and then tally bumblebees and carpenter bees that you see visiting all the plants. And so the emphasis here is you record every flower species, whether or not bees are on them. So after you do your 30-minute walk, you have one estimate of floral abundance, which is floral rank. And this, it's really just which flower is there the most of. And a more technical way to think about this is if you were to pull all of the blooms off of a species and spread them to a flat surface area, which one would have the greatest area? And we have to do this because I would expect many of you have encountered how difficult it is to quantify flowers due to this great structural diversity. I think this is a fun, this yarrow here, it's just like a single floret. And I like that because I think it captures how what we call a flower is not a flower, and a composite is actually hundreds of flowers. So how can we count these things? We don't, we just rank them. So our analyses, I think, are relatively straightforward. So I'll give a little overview of the data and then talk about the 3 metrics which we use to quantify preference. So we received around 1,000 surveys, which was really awesome. And I can't believe that we got so much participation. I'm very grateful. We only have been able to process around 800 because it has been very labor intensive and we have not been able to hire help. So lots of entering papered things with common names and translating to Latin. But yeah, so we got around 800 entered, which were from the region, which we got our original funding for, Fish and Wildlife Service Region 5. And then that, with various filters, went down to 570. So that's the data set we're working with. And that included 25,000 bumblebee visits and 2,500 carpenter bee visits roughly. And in those surveys, we saw 550 flower genera, but because people are surveying wherever they want, there's no standardization of what flowers they're seeing. Only 109 were on at least 30 surveys, which was our cutoff to be included in analysis. And for species, we had 1,300, but down to 111 that met our cutoff. And this data was collected by 85 people. And we have a 600-person network in our email list. So it's pretty great to have such a far reach and hopefully share this information and make it valuable. So to break down those bumblebee visits, these were all of the species that we saw. I'll highlight that the common eastern bumblebee dominates and a lot of unknown species, which even if you know how to identify bumblebees to species, there will be some that you can't get the right angle on or something. So we love to see genus level IDs here. That's super helpful still. Most of all the analysis we're going to look at here is genus level bees because, it's hard to make many conclusions off of 54 visits. We could look at impatiens, but it's pretty much the only one. So our preference metrics, we have 3, and I'll dig into each of them, but as overview, we have % of surveys with visitation, Sam and my B score that we developed, and an adaptation done by our botanist, Jared Fowler, on an existing model from the literature published by Alexander Harmon Threat, which I'll have the full citation for later. So % of surveys with visitation is quite straightforward. It's just and I should say, I have white clover in rather than saying for a given flower species. I thought it would be a little bit more intuitive to just use clover as an example, but this is how we do the analysis for all species. So what % of surveys with clover saw bees visit it? That also looks like number of surveys with visits to clover over total number of surveys to clover. So this really gets at if you put a plant out there, is it always being visited? Is it being visited almost all the time it's out there? We don't consider floral abundance, so it's definitely not standardized significantly, but it is interesting to see what is visited almost every time it's available. So Sam and my B score, we're trying to standardize a little bit more here to get a sense of if plants were available in equal amounts, what would be visited, where % of surveys with visitation doesn't consider floral rank at all. Here, we're really trying to see if we could equalize the amount of each plant species on one survey, which plants are they going to? So we're really focused on within a single survey here. And this is getting back to what I was mentioning earlier, that we want to capture the effect of the floral context and see how neighboring plants might inform our understanding of how preferred a plant is. So we do this using 2 components, an adjusted floral rank and the % of bees. So % of bees is just if a survey had 100 bees and all 100 went to clover, clover got 100% of the bees on that survey. So this is really helpful for us because it allows us to retain information from surveys with low numbers of bees. So by doing this on a per survey basis, a survey with 5 bees, if all 5 went to clover, is the same as a survey with 100 bees if they all go to clover. So this is helpful because sometimes in the spring, you have really low bumblebee populations. It's just queens or super low numbers of workers. So you might have low numbers of bumblebees, but it doesn't reflect that a plant is not preferred. It's just there are not many bumblebees in this area. So we don't want to really swamp those out relative to the fall data when we have massive colonies with huge numbers. So that's our goal here. Adjusted floral rank is a way of standardizing our data a little bit. You could have a survey with 5 flowers or a survey with 50 flowers. So a survey ranked 5 out of 5 is the least abundant plant on your survey. Ranked 5 out of 50 is not the least abundant plant on your survey. So, by doing this correction, rather than having 5 and 5, we would have 1 and 0.1. Okay, so again, it's just multiplying those 2 values together. So we're trying to see that a high B score reflects plants which get a high % of the bees that are available on that survey, boosted further if they're not available in a high amount. So This Jared Fowler, our amazing botanist, he's very smart. I feel very fortunate to have him on the team. He adapted this model from Alexander Harmon Threat, Perry DeValpine, and Claire Kremen. And he adapted their model to fit our data structure. So this is a very similar metric to the previous one, except it's across all surveys. So now we're doing things in bulk. So again, it's pretty much the same equation as an adjusted floral rank times the percent of bees, except now it's across all surveys. So the percent of bees across all surveys is looking at our final data set, how many bees were on clover out of the total number, out of all 25,000 bumblebee visits, how many of those were on clover. So here you can see how some of those low bumblebee count surveys would be a little washed out because a survey with 5 bees isn't really contributing to our numerator if the other survey has 100. So adjusted floral rank, it's just the same exact thing as before. You divide the rank over by the maximum rank, and then we average that across all surveys for each plant. Okay, so here we're boosting plants which are receiving a lot of bees, especially if they're of low floral abundance. It doesn't really matter if they got all of the bees on the survey, but as long as they got a high number of bees. So to sort of compare these metrics, I think it's really great that we have all three. I wish that I felt like there was one number that could capture all of this, but I find it very challenging to capture ecology in just one or even a couple metrics, but I like how they complement each other and can sort of help us tackle this question of what plants to plant from a couple slightly different perspectives. So again, percent of surveys with visitation, something's visited whenever it's available. If it has a super high percent of surveys with visitation, it's visited reliably and consistently, but maybe not getting a ton of bees, but getting some. Same in my bee score, it's getting a high percent of the bees in the area. And that's one that I have moved forward with for sharing results. That is the metric that we have based the following results slides on, because I do think it is the best way to avoid completely losing all of our spring plants. But I do appreciate having the Fowler adapted Harmon threat score to complement that, to make sure that we're not ignoring which plants are actually supporting the highest numbers of bees. So here are our top genera, and I'll say, people, you're welcome to take pictures or anything. All of this information's on our website, and I have some QR codes at the end of the results section that link to all of these things. So no pressure to take any pictures or anything. If you want this information, there will be QR codes. I think a lot of this is not surprising if you are watching bumblebees, like seeing things like asters and vetches. Like these are plants which I think many people knew are good bumblebee plants. But on the flip side, some things like ground ivy I find interesting. This is non-native, and it is not a plant that people like, I think generally. It's pretty aggressive. And I think this also highlights how we're sharing these results to say what bumblebees visited, not to say what you should plant. You should definitely interpret these results from perspectives of, is this native? Is this going to do well in my habitat? Is this going to support other specialist bees rather than other bumblebees? So not to say plants that aren't on this list are bad, or all of these plants are good, but these are what the bumblebees visited. Yeah, and so I think ground ivy also makes it on this list because we saw a lot of queens visiting it early in the spring. And unfortunately, we didn't get many surveys at all with the good native spring plants. We have no willows. Like we're missing a lot of spring data, I think. And it also seems like some of these good spring plants are just absent, at least from the landscapes that people did survey. So for ground ivy to be an important nutrition source for queens is probably not an ideal state for them, but it was interesting to see. So here were some that they weren't at the top, they weren't at the bottom, they got some visits, but weren't super popular. One thing that I want to highlight is partridge peas are on here. And this is another I think it reflects another challenge of trying to capture ecology with some numbers. Partridge peas are visited super early in the morning, and we don't have much data from the time when they are at peak visitation. And even if we did, it would then pose a different challenge because other plants that they may have in the surrounding area would not be visited that early in the morning. So how can we really do a survey and say which is preferred when they're preferred at different times of day, maybe? Challenges. If you have ideas, let me know. So these were some that didn't do so well. I think some of them do reflect some of the misunderstandings about what bumblebees visit. I think a lot of people believe that some wild carrots or dandelions or even fleabanes or daisies and yarrows, some of these things I think people sort of think of as a little bit bumbly just from maybe the shape of the flower, or I think some seed mixes include them, but question seed mixes. And another, senna should not be here. Senna, this is where it fell in our data, but thanks to a great plant person, somebody reached out and was like, wild senna is a very popular bumblebee plant. Why is that? And you're not preferred. I was like, great point. The same thing as partridge pea. It's visited very early in the morning. There's also a chance that we only observe species of senna that were like cultivars that they didn't like, or, you know, there's diversity within the genus that is not, we don't have that information here. But I want to highlight that this is where it fell in our data, but I'm not telling people not to plant sennas, and I do think bumblebees like senna. So now we have some species level results, and I have a lot of these tables, so I'll probably start moving a little bit quicker just for the sake of time and because everything is linked. Yeah, I think once again, a lot of these are pretty expected, seeing some asters and mountain mints and hyssops, bergamot, goldenrod, beard tongue, the classics. It's good to confirm that the classics are good. So these were, again, that middle level got visits, but weren't the top ones. One thing I appreciated was a lot of these culinary herbs do well if you let them flower, and then it's also great because who doesn't want oregano? So these were is this, I think, continued medium? Yes. And it was interesting to me to see some of the, some Monarda species were less preferred than others. I again think partridge pea maybe would make it to the top if we could figure out a way to accurately represent it. Virginia mountain mint, I was kind of surprised to see down here. And these were the not so popular ones. These at the bottom, the last, at least these ones, all 0 bumblebees across all of the surveys, which I was a bit surprised for Coreopsis, over 30 surveys and not a single bumblebee. So if you do want any of the results, I would recommend scanning this one if you are curious to see these, because they're not up on our website yet. I hope to get them up as soon as possible, hopefully within the next week or two. These ones are already up under findings, so only scan it if it's more convenient to you to directly download that. And this includes the actual numbers and all of the various metrics. There's more than the 3, but those are the 3 that we made decisions based on. And then I also would be happy to share the data sets if anybody's interested in working with the data. There's so much I want to do with it, and I do not have the time. So I would really love if somebody else could start chipping away at those things. So our future goals, thanks to the Maryland Native Plant Society, we've got a garden on the horizon. So we have received funding from you all to build a garden with our top 25 plants. It might not be the exact top 25 based on our ability to grow them in that location and source them, but we're going to have a garden of 25 great bumblebee plants in equal area all together. So this will be a super cool opportunity to explore how floral context does affect visitation, and our first opportunity really to have standardized areas for plants. So I hope that this can unlock potentially some new analyses or illuminate some interesting trends. I think I'm excited about that. So yeah, we want to keep digging into some of these trends and things like the time of day, working on resolving those sort of questions. We also are really excited about collaborating with pretty much any groups. We think the survey is great for everyone. So if any master naturalist or master gardener or other kind of groups that you're involved in you think would be a good fit, please just send them our way or share their contact information with me. It would be great. And eventually, Sam has big goals to expand across the whole continent, which would be cool. We'll see. I think we have some steps first, but that hopefully. Okay, and with this data, we hope to improve planting guides for homeowners or land managers or anyone really, and enhance our understanding of bee preference with a little bit more of a comprehensive perspective on the neighboring plants. So, as you all likely know, if you want to help bumblebees, you should plant plants which they like that bloom for their entire active season. So that phenology is huge. You don't want to support them a ton in the spring and build their populations up and then let them crash in the fall when there's no food left. So for bumblebees, it's really March through October if possible. But of course, those earliest and latest months can be a challenge. I also like to plug, this is a resource that Jared Fowler, our botanist, made. You can input information about your site conditions or features of a plant that you want. You don't have to fill all of them in, but you could. And then it will recommend plants which bumblebees like and suit your conditions. And Jared did review every single picture that we received. So all of the data that we received, Jared went through, and he didn't include that in like a super quantified way, but he definitely used that insight to inform this. So I think I would say it's somewhat based on our data, but not in a very rigorous way. Okay, the bee facts. Only female bees can sting. I think this is something that many people don't know. And maybe I'm biased because I knew nothing about bees before I started this program, but I definitely didn't know this. And it's actually because a stinger is an ovipositor. So they'd still use their stinger to lay eggs, but males do not have the machinery that they would need to sting. So this is a handy fact, I think, when we see male carpenter bees like fighting on your deck looking for mates in the spring. They're males. If they have a white face and they're hovering, looking at each other, they're almost always males. So as Sam likes to say, you can just grab them out of the air. It's his recommendation. And then if you want to look cool to your friends, you can blow on your hand. But I do think it's, the more you learn about insects, I think you learn that you don't have to be afraid of as many of them as you would think. So there's around 4,000 bee species in the US and around 400 in Maryland. And a lot of them are like this one, gorgeous green. So many of them are really not how we visualize bees typically. Only one of these 4,000 bees is a honeybee and produces honey in the way that we think of it. And most of them are around the size of a grain of rice and black. So you might think of them as a fly if you see them. But lots of bees, and they're all important to pollination in their own ways. So, as I mentioned, only honeybees produce substantial amounts of honey. This is a cute little bumblebee. And I say substantial because there is a tiny bit of honey in bumblebee nests, but it's really only enough to support their hive for a couple of days if they needed to do that. And if you think of the scale of a honeybee hive with hundreds or tens of thousands of individuals, a bumblebee colony will maybe be 100. So it's going to be not worth a human's time to harvest it. Some indigenous groups have done this historically, but definitely not from a commercial perspective. And then also stingless bees in South America do produce honey, which some people eat, but we don't have those in our area. So honeybees are the only bees that die when they sting. I love this picture. You can see they die because their stingers are barbed. So these serrations, when they get stuck in your like elastic skin, it just rips the bee's abdomen and they die. So sometimes it doesn't happen if their abdomen doesn't get pulled out. That's totally possible. I think that's also some misconception. People are like, it didn't die, so it couldn't be a honeybee. It's possible that it just doesn't get stuck. But yeah, I think this picture is incredible because they said it was serrated, but I didn't believe it. So there are no known allergies to solitary bees. You may be asking, what is a solitary bee? That is a whole rabbit hole. But broadly, pretty much everything that people in the general public, and maybe you all know more because you're plant people, but I definitely didn't know this. Only honeybees have these massive multi-year hives with one queen and super complex sociality with cooperative work. Almost all bees are solitary, so it will be a single female goes and nests, and she provisions maybe at most around 10 individual bees, 10 individual progeny in one cell, or sorry, in one little nest, maybe under the ground or in a crevice somewhere. And then she will just leave. And that is all. She provisioned those young, and then they will hatch and do it all over. So it's a life cycle almost like any other insect or most other things. Honeybees are really unique in their life cycles, and it's what we hear about. So I think it's really cool to think about this from an evolutionary perspective. It's worth honeybees' while to evolve chemical defenses against mammals because they have these hives, which are like chock full of juicy grubs and all this honey, where a solitary bee nest is like a little hole in the ground with tiny eggs that would not be a meal worth it for like a badger or a bear. So honeybees did evolve with mammalian threats where other bees didn't. And then they evolved chemicals which are toxic to mammals, which includes us. So solitary bees have had no reason to evolve those defenses, and there have been no reports of people having allergic reactions to solitary bees. Bumblebees are not quite solitary. They're not social like honeybees, but they have something called primitive eusociality. So I'm going to jump into the life cycle a little bit. As I mentioned, bumblebees will maybe have 100 individuals in a nest. So they do have some cooperative work. It starts with a queen emerging from her little overwintering hideout, maybe a leaf pile. She'll emerge in the spring, and she'll go and forage and get some nectar to refresh herself, and then go and search for a nest site. So that could be in a log or a rodent hole or a tree or pretty much anywhere. They nest many places. It's pretty hard to find them, but if you see bumblebees low to the ground, it's pretty cool to see if you can find their nest. It's because it is a little bit rare and not the behavior we normally see them doing on flowers. So she'll find a nest site, and she'll begin creating these little wax cups, which she'll put in some pollen and then lay eggs into. So it'll just be a loaf of pollen and then a little egg, and then it will develop and consume that pollen. And she actually broods her eggs similarly to a bird. So bumblebees can pump their hemolymph, which is sort of like their blood, between their abdomen and their thorax, and it can keep the heat sort of where they want it, and they can use it to keep their eggs warm. So initially the queen, she does everything herself. She goes and she finds the nest, and then she forages and she provisions all the cells, and then she broods them. But then finally the first brood emerges, and she has workers to help her. So her first generation is a bunch of workers, which then go out and do the foraging and also incubate some eggs. So here is some incubation. Here, I think, is some foraging. This is a really nice diagram from Jeremy Hemberger. So one thing I think is an interesting note is when the queen's doing all the work herself, she's kind of struggling to make ends meet. Like bumblebees will often be pretty small, this first generation of workers, because if it takes, I heard it takes around 400 milligrams of pollen to make a bumblebee on average. So that's like 2 aspirin. And if she has to go collect all of that herself for each individual, maybe she'll skimp a little bit and have a little bit less pollen and make a slightly small bee. But once all the workers are here and there's a whole crew out foraging, they can get sufficient pollen, and the bees are bigger later in the year. So here we have some workers helping. The queen is now staying in her hive, just brooding and caring for the young. And then in the late summer and fall, more generations continue. And finally, when we're approaching winter, the queen will make some reproductive females called gynes, which will be the new queens for the following year, and also make some males. So hopefully they will leave and mate with individuals from other hives, and then the cycle begins again. All of the workers and males die every year. A queen pretty much just lasts 1 year, and then the females who do mate are the only ones who overwinter. So no worker or male bees survive the winter, where honeybee hives are intact throughout that whole period, and that's how they're able to keep building up larger numbers. So here's a little picture from iNaturalist of likely a nest in a tree. I put a question mark because I can't see inside, but I think we have good reason to believe this. And I thought this was super cool. This is what it looks like on the inside. This is a nest box that somebody on iNaturalist made in like a Folgers coffee container, stuffed with some sort of cottony material and a pool noodle, I believe. So I don't know that this is a habitat that's maybe representative of ecology, but it's super cool to be able to actually see the inner workings of the nest. And here you can kind of see those cups that I was mentioning. This might have pollen or nectar or young in there, but these are sort of the waxy structures. And roughly the biggest they can get, people say, is about the size of a football. So those are bumblebee nests. They're pretty poorly understood, but I mean, clearly we know some things if we can see pictures like this. So while pollen collection is such a critical part of the bee life cycle that we think of, around 20% of bee species are actually nest parasites. So this means that they don't collect pollen at all. They'll instead steal the nest of a different bee, essentially. So they will go and find the nest of a different bee and take over and steal all of the labor from that colony to instead support them and their young. Pretty ferocious. And I like its little suspicious arms. I think it was reflective of its suspicious nature. So all bees evolved from wasps, ants as well. Wasps are the ancestor to bees and to ants and to wasps, of course. I think that people should give wasps a little bit more credit because they gave us bees and they're also important in their own right. And this one looks like it has a mustache. So I've reached the point where I will try to sell carpenter bees to homeowners. It can be tough, but they're family oriented. So this is one thing that I think is adorable. As I mentioned, the solitary bee life cycle is not a very compassionate one. Most of these moms, they'll provision the young, but they leave when they're still eggs, so they never even interact at all with their offspring. But carpenter bees can live up to 3 years, and they often will stay in the same spot in your deck with their family. So you can have some daughters and the parent all in one nest for multiple years. And there actually has been records of them feeding their young. So that's almost unheard of in bees. Once they emerge, they're not being fed like the way we care for our young, but carpenter bees have been found to do that. People did some scanning in their hives and saw that behavior. This, I think, is a really cute and fun picture. So here is a gallery, and here you can see the exit hole that we would probably see from the outside. But they go, and they're remarkably good at staying in a flat plane. So if you have a 2x4, they can consume most of it without ever coming out because they want to be inside. They don't want to find the other end. So it's rare for this sort of damage alone to actually cause real structural collapse. But then once you have lots of these holes and they're full of nice grubby things, maybe some birds will come and finally rip it all apart. So I will admit that there can be structural consequences to carpenter bees, but they're still cute. So this, I think, is a really awesome observation from iNaturalist. Here you can see a well-developed pupa, a slightly less developed pupa, some larvae, and I believe this is another larva, but their eggs are huge, but I think it's a larva. yeah, so this doesn't really show their family-oriented nature, but I think it is an amazing visual of what a pupa of a bee looks like. And the way they just wall off these little cells for each individual. So carpenter bees also have the world's largest known insect egg, up to 15 millimeters long. Isn't that crazy? But it's only around 3 millimeters in diameter on average. So it's almost looks like a little larva, I feel, but a 15 millimeter long egg is crazy. So now the damage. If once carpenter bees start a hole, it's pretty easy for them to keep digging it deeper and deeper. So if you do want to prevent carpenter bee damage, filling holes would be the route to go. I say traps won't help because there is an infinite pool of carpenter bees out there, and you can have traps and pull them in and feel like you're killing a lot of them, which you would be, but they're just going to keep coming and filling the empty space. You'll just be killing them, but it won't actually be preventing any damage. But filling existing holes is pretty productive because it's difficult for them to start a new hole. They're completely exposed for predators, and they don't have something to hold on to. Once they make a little nook, they're protected and they can just kind of sit in there and eat away. But initially they're hovering and scraping, and that's difficult. So once it's established is a better time to target it. And if you do want to do that, the best thing to do is use steel wool and caulk or a roofing nail. But I will say they overwinter in the hive together. So as Sam always says, you will be entombing a family. But it's what you got to do sometimes to keep your house from crumbling. So that concludes why carpenter bees are our friends. Back to bee facts. Bees don't see red, which maybe this is a very plant-oriented fact. So I'm curious if this is a more common knowledge among this audience. But yeah, sort of, you might think of pollination syndromes. Birds like to visit red things often, and bees tend to go for yellow, white, and blue generally. And they can see UV, which is pretty interesting. So speaking of foraging, not all bees even forage for nectar. This is an oil collecting bee, and this is its tongue, just fully extended. And this is its leg. It packs the oils onto that slab of leg. So yeah, some collect floral oils and some are even carnivorous. So there is a lot of diversity to bee life history. 35% of known pollen collecting bees, so not parasitic bees, are specialists. So this could be specialized on a family or a genus or even a species. And I think this really captures the importance of native plants and how if you don't have that one specific plant, the bees will not survive. So I think focusing on specialists is often a great way to be efficient in your help. If you want to help bees, plant native plants. So this is Sam, who I keep mentioning. I think he is really the inspiration for this program. So I always like to give him a big shout out. And I think this is a good quote that represents at least plant something. Nobody needs more lawn. That is an instrument. But you know what? I bet with him it would attract bees. Oh, what are those things called? Yeah, is it? Yeah. Yes. What is it called? A jaw harp? I'm uninformed.
The conversation in the room is a jaw harp or didgeridoo is what we're looking for.
Bees. Okay, so I actually, maybe I have ran through and I have reached my ending. So I really hope that I hear from some of you. I would love for you to take a real critical look at our results and let me know if any plants are, maybe missing, which is probably that we're data deficient, but it's good to know from the people who know plants, which ones should we be really maybe making a concerted effort to reach our cutoff of 30 surveys for some specific species that we should be exploring. Or if you see a plant that you think is ranked too high or ranked too low based on your observations, that's really helpful for me to know. Or if you just have any ideas or options for collaboration, anything, please reach out. I would love to hear from you. And then here is a QR code to this website, which is our website. And you can also just Google Ask a Bumblebee. And it's run through Ohio State. Ohio's not even in our target region, but they have a big Bumblebee program and they're super great and helpful. Denise Ellsworth runs our website. She's amazing. So that's why it's an Ohio website. But that is all I have. If there are any questions or.
I was wondering if it would be better to fill in the carpenter bee holes in the spring or summer, so you maybe don't capture as many or trap as many.
Yeah, I think that is a good idea. At least some may be out. And then also maybe if you like knock on it or something. I don't know if they're in there, like get out. It's eviction.
I'll do that. Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Michael Wilpers.
Thank you. Let's see, I got two questions. One is, what percentage of Maryland's bees, especially bumblebees, are specialists? I gather the 35% is a global fraction. And the other question I had is, from all those genera that are very popular with bumblebees, can you generalize in any way about the flower shapes that they go for and avoid?
Yeah, that's great. So I definitely can't speak to what percent of Maryland's bees are specialists. I don't know very much about bees beyond bumblebees, to be honest. But so all bumblebees are relatively generalist, which I feel kind of funny saying with this whole floral preference project. Like clearly they do have some preferences, but none of them are specialized on a specific family in the way that we would give them a specialist title. I also, with your shape question, that's something that I have sort of been surprised not to see a more clear answer to. There's definitely some long-tongued bumblebees and some short-tongued bumblebees. I believe the dark wing ones, which would be like Pennsylvanicus, the American bumblebee, and Oricomis, which is the half-black bumblebee, I believe are long-tongued. And those ones do tend to go for things with a longer neck, so maybe something more like, I'm hesitant to throw out actual species because I would like to look at my data first, but definitely there is some difference between the long-tongue bee preference and the short-tongue bee preference. And if we had enough data to dig into that, that's something that I really am interested in exploring. I think broadly, bumblebees are thought to like pretty open flowers, so composites, they're often thought to like. But then on the flip side, I see a lot of bumblebees in my hostas looking really cute with their little legs sticking out. And like penstemon was really high up there. So I feel like between mountain mint and bee balm and penstemon, we have a lot of different floral structures. But I would be interested to see if we maybe assigned each flower like a structure category and did some more exploration into that. That would be very interesting. And I'm sure there is some literature on it that I just have not read. Thank you for your question.
Carol, if you want to unmute.
Hi, yes, this is terrific. The question I had is, knowing carpenter bees are valuable, we try and coexist with them, but they are doing a lot of damage to a fence post. I've heard or read somewhere that one thing that can work to sort of divert them is putting up a piece of soft wood that sort of for their use. But do you know if they have any requirements for, direction they face or morning sun or afternoon shade?
I wish that Sam was here because he does that. He has a bunch of softwood planks nailed up on the bee lab. And I think that there is a direction, but I do not know it. So he has said that he does the planks because he likes to see carpenter bees and he doesn't think that it reduces damage for him. He thinks I think back to that concept of the infinite pool of carpenter bees, that they will just do both. Yeah, I think unfortunately filling holes is one of the only ways to mitigate the damage.
Well,
Or building with hardwood.
yeah, well, and I wouldn't, yeah, well, the structure's already there, but yes, I would feel less bad about filling the holes if they've got somewhere else to go. So thank
Yeah.
you.
And thank you for your compassion for the carpenter bees.
Vaughn, do you want to go ahead?
Seems to me that what you're getting at with your preferences is a bumblebee's nutritional preference. I mean, they're not going for like Chanel #5 and versus, Dior or whoever. So the point is, do you have that analysis? Is that what you're working on when you talk about preferences? And I just think that's part of the nutritional. We are aware of what we do, and I think the bumblebees are doing it naturally, and it just seems very useful so that when you're planting a garden, you can put all those factors in, including that. And that's probably already what you're seeing, but I just wanted to ask it that way.
Yeah, that is such a great point. We unfortunately don't do anything with nutritional composition. That's one of the things that I would love to see what existing information is out there about, like, if there's information about the nutritional content of different flower species, then I could hopefully include that information. The thought of trying to determine the nutritional content of the species is very daunting and I think beyond my scope. But I imagine that there is a lot of this information out there, and it is probably ramping up in quantity and quality. So I definitely agree that the nutritional value is important to this question of preference. And it's so interesting how they manage their nutrition without, any of the things that we sort of think of, like no dietitian or whatever. Yeah, and it brings me back to how complex preference is as a concept. It's like, I can talk about it and do my best to approximate preference, but I think really what I'm capturing is like, what are we seeing bumblebees visit if we had those plants in equal abundance, which philosophically is not preference, but it's a rabbit hole.
So I did read about leafcutter bees because I was interested in alfalfa, and in central Illinois and the places where my family's from, it's grown for forage. It's not really for seeds, but in North Dakota, they grow it for seeds. So they want to know what pollinates alfalfa, and it's leafcutter bees. And they did a nutritional analysis on pollen for lipids, and it was just it was fascinating. So that's why I asked my question. I think it is out there, but we don't seem to. That was an agricultural research, so that's, I think, the future. Anyway, thanks for letting me
It's
talk
so
again.
cool. And with that ground ivy example, it's like, what are they getting from ground ivy? I'm assuming it's not an equal replacement to some great native plant, because we know ecology is more complicated than that. But without this nutritional information, it's really hard to get at. And one thing that would also be cool is even to keep an eye out for, are they collecting pollen from this plant and packing it onto their corbicula, or are they just nectaring? Some of these plants seem to be nectar plants and some are pollen, and they tend to be more specific about where they're getting pollen from because it has more complex chemicals that might be challenging to digest, where nectar is pretty much sugar water and sometimes has a lower concentration of those chemicals as well. Yeah, so I don't even know what they're getting from the plant, much less the chemical composition of what they're getting. But I would love to.
I'm going to quickly take a question from the chat. Peg is saying that she has never joined the citizen survey because it wasn't clear to her how the entire process worked. She's still not clear. And she's wondering if there's some kind of sheet that can spell out how to participate.
Yeah, so we do have, that's a great point. And I will say, I haven't pushed that too hard today, which I would love if you all go do surveys. That's excellent. We don't have funding right now to process surveys. So hopefully I have time to do that, but I'm trying to not make any promises and then regret it when I'm under a mountain of data sheets. But there is still, our instructions are up. You totally could participate. There is a very in-depth, like multi-page instruction sheet. And I do think that maybe I should make a one-pager, which is less daunting than our very in-depth instructions. I also did do a webinar back in 2021 where I walk through how to participate, and that is linked on the website. So I often recommend people listen to the how to survey part of that webinar. Thank you for your interest. I can appreciate that it can be challenging to first get involved. I think the more surveys you do, it gets easier and easier.
Hi, this is Lauren. Where is it here? Hi. So I have a couple things. First of all, that is super fascinating. And I feel like you have just cracked open Pandora's box. So when you go for your PhD, your project is laying there waiting for you, I hope. Because
Fingers
there's
crossed.
so many things I feel like you could do. Well, we'll survey in wild spaces only and not people's gardens and all those questions. But anyway, so that's very cool. You've started a whole new line of science, basically.
Thank you. That's very sweet.
So I have a question about how you knew that some of the bees preferred the plants only in the morning. So the senna, for example. So that's one question. How did you know that? And I have senna, so I'm going to go look in the morning. And then also, you didn't really talk about the carpenter bee preferences. And I'm wondering how different that was, or if you could touch on it a little bit.
Yes.
I happen to know, at least in my garden, that the carpenter bees really seem to prefer the Monarda punctata, which I noticed was not so favored by the bumblebees on your list, but who knows? I do have a lot of carpenter bees, so maybe I just have a lot of carpenter bees. I don't
Right.
really know. So I'll leave it at that, but this is super cool. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So for our carpenter bee results, that is something that I should have gotten into, but I when I ran through it, I didn't have time, but now I had time. So on the website, we do have one sheet that is the carpenter bee results and the bumblebee results side by side, which I think is pretty interesting. Part of our curiosity is like, a carpenter bee is essentially a bumblebee mimic. They have a much weaker sting than a bumblebee, kind of surprisingly, with their big, scary look. But we're like, they're so structurally similar. Do they have similar preferences? And there's definitely some overlap, and some things were not. Some preferred plants for bumblebees were not preferred for carpenter bees, and vice versa. So I definitely would recommend checking out the findings tab on the website for that, because I cannot think of any of those plants off the top of my head. And I'm sorry, you had a two-part question. Oh, the morning plants. That is, I think people like yourself, like people told me actually, I see partridge bee getting a ton of bees in the morning. And I'm like, oh, I am inside on my computer. But it's the people who are outside looking at things just telling me. And then Sam is also a great resource for that. I think he is chock full of ecological knowledge that I am a little bit deficient in. But that's, help me, share your wealth of knowledge.
Liz McDowell is asking what kind of geographic area the surveys were done in.
So that's a great point. I should have had that in my first slide. They're all from between West Virginia up to Maine, so the Northeast US. The vast majority are from the DMV, pretty much. A lot of Maryland, a lot of Virginia, a good number in Maine, a good number in Pennsylvania. Those are most of them.
Jack Bain is asking, how can public gardens best support this line of science?
Oh. I mean, participation is always great. If there's any opportunities for people to like do the survey on planted lands, that could be great. Or reach out to me if there's more opportunities for maybe like tailored collaborations for this specific group. Doing surveys, I think, is the number one thing. Or if anybody's like really interested and wants to join the volunteer workforce of Ask a Bumblebee, that's me, so it's greatly appreciated. Yeah, if anybody wants to help in any way, it's totally welcome to just reach out to me, but I think surveying is the most straightforward way to help.
Donna asked way up earlier in the chat, do bumblebees go for any kind of nectar guide light spectral patterns?
I have no idea. Do you know? There's another bee person in the audience.
You've stumped the expert.
Yeah, I wish Sam was here.
We have a number of people who in the chat have kind of mentioned some of the anecdotal stuff about what kind of plants bees like. So
Okay.
things like penstemon. We have somebody who mentioned that tomato plants need buzz pollination to make the fruit. So HM says they're very glad to have enough bumblebees to pollinate their tomatoes.
Oh, that's great.
We have some people who are saying pickerelweed and many other water plants, buttonbush, lavender, milkweed, joe pye, glaucoma, all sorts of different species like that.
Those are all very good ones.
This is Lauren. So because of trees being trees and they're tall, I'm assuming that sort of thing, you couldn't really capture the information.
Yeah.
Any insights on how you might, I'm thinking drones, you know.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Because there's like the, you know, Tilia, which is the bee tree, it's called the bee tree, which is a Native American tree, and it's in the spring when it's blooming, it is literally buzzing.
Wow.
And I think there are a lot of bumblebees up there because I used to have one across from my house and I could look out my second floor window and see fairly large insects. So I'm kind of thinking it was bumblebees. So that would be an interesting thing to see how that impacts, you know, and you mentioned the willows, right? You don't have a lot of willows out in the landscape that you're capturing in your surveys. So that's a whole nother piece.
Yeah, that's for our survey purposes, we just say anything over 10 feet above your head don't count. I say as you're walking, pretend you're in like a bubble with a 10-foot radius around you, and then that's your survey area. But of course, that's not a solution to this. That's just like where we call it quits, basically. I would be interested. I'm sure people are looking into that, and I should find that literature. Drones seem like potentially a logical way. I know Sam at the Bee Lab was working on a lot of time-lapse photography and trying to capture visitation by just setting it up on one or a couple flowers. I wonder, another thing that some people do is rather than looking for visitation, like collecting the pollen with some pollen traps, you can sort of steal the pollen baskets off their legs and do these molecular analyses to see what plants they are. But I don't know if clearly you would get different information from that than actually being able to see the bees up there. Another interesting challenge.
So we have a couple more people saying species that they can confirm: wingstem in late summer and fall, Impatiens capensis. We do have another question from Peg. Are the foods and or plants that we've been talking about for bumblebees also important for kind of the tiny species of bees?
I would definitely think that for some of them, some of the 4,000, yes, that I would not extrapolate these results in any way to other bees. I would say just by chance. I'm sure a lot of these are good, and probably a lot of the natives are good because we know how that works. If it's a native flowering plant, it is supporting some pollinator in our area. Yeah, I think a lot of these plants are good for the other bees. Like mountain mint, for example, I think is just sort of a party plant for many insects. But there's definitely, like, for example, an example of a plant which bumblebees don't visit at all, but it's very important to some other bees, spring beauty, as my transition slide. No bumblebees visit spring beauty, but it does have a specialist which only visits it. So it is, just one of those examples of a non-bumblebee plant that's very important still.
We have a question earlier in the chat from Carol. She's asking, can you leave old tree trunks or other sources of kind of decaying wood for carpenter bees, or do they have to have like new wood?
I believe decaying wood is good. I do not have much knowledge about this, but I definitely have seen some carpenter bee nests in like fallen logs and things. It would be interesting to see if they have any sort of preference for the wood that we use to develop things, or if we just only notice them in those settings more often. But definitely they can nest in natural woods.
Couple more species that people are mentioning, flax, and Fawn said that 2 spotted bumblebees are collecting pollen from St. John's wort right now.
Oh, that's late.
Yeah, I was wondering about the interaction between bumblebees and, say, other insects on the same plants. For example, I have noticed that mountain mint, really attracts a lot and not necessarily all at the same time. I was just wondering about that interaction between, say, wasps and bumblebees.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm curious how good our understanding of that is overall. I haven't, in my personal observations, I've never seen much like aggression between these things. And I know then people you hear all these tales of like Africanized honeybees or the Asian giant hornet and these really aggressive wasps. But I think pretty much everything that at least is native here has really co-evolved nicely, and maybe partitions with time of day. That could be a really cool thing to explore. I'm sure some do it. I just couldn't think of which ones do that. And then it is interesting to see like competition for a specific flower. Is there any aggression? I know that there's some records of that, but it's not something that I am aware of as being a major like concern for bumblebees at all. But I suppose with native competitors, it wouldn't be a concern. I know there's lots of questions about honeybees versus other bees because they're sheer numbers. But yeah, that's a great question. That another one that I wish I was a bee expert, but I don't know.
Go ahead, sorry. Just on that, question of different bees, certain sedum, autumn joy sedum, and also eupatoriums, I don't know, it's
rotten
thoroughwort,
one or
something,
something.
yeah, it's late something or other. I just have seen every kind of bee. I mean, tiny bees, large bees, wasps, bumblebees, honeybees, and they can be right next to each other of all sizes. And you can stand there and stare at them and pet them practically.
Yeah,
The bumblebees,
the little pet.
and there's no aggression. It seems to be extremely, they're busy on their own thing.
Yeah, it is remarkable. Especially for, I think how scary so many humans find wasps and bees, that they can just be basically touching on the same flowers and not bothering each other. And I do think that it's rare for there to be a floral resource and it to be the limiting factor. Like I think often there's no resource at all, or there is sufficient bloom for them to share. I think the problem is really like we've eliminated their habitat altogether and they can't fly within their maximum flight distance to find a patch. It's generally, I think, a single flower has a pretty significant amount of resource to offer.
So I have a comment, which is I think there's a difference between aggression and competition. So I haven't really seen bees being aggressive towards each other. But if, say, a European honeybee gets to a flower first and removes the nectar, then when, say, a bumble goes for it, there might be nothing there and they have to go on to a different flower. So I see more competition than aggression occurring.
Yeah, that's a great point. It is so interesting how, yeah, maybe there is resource limitation and they're just not becoming aggressive over it. in a very, I feel like that's a very personified lens of like, there's not enough food. Yeah, that is a fascinating question that I think is pretty hard to investigate with experiments or surveys. I know a lot of people sort of try to explore that, but I wish that I had a more firm, like, yes, the competition is significant and affecting their ability to forage, or no, it's not. I don't really know.
Another point is that regarding the person who said, do the other native bees that are not bumbles, do they go to the same flower species? And I would think in certain situations that might be the case, but the non-bumbles have a higher percentage of species that are specialists. So like you were saying, the spring beauty, there's a spring beauty bee. Likewise, a lot of other flowers, there might be a specialist bee, and that bee would be less likely to go to the full range of flowers that the non-specialist bumbles would go to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And part of that is timing. Bumbles have a wider window in terms of timing when they're around. A particular bumble, and in fact, a bumble colony could exist throughout the whole growing season, whereas a lot of specialist bees are only going to be out when their particular plant is supposed to be blooming. Though with climate change, there can be a bit of a mismatch there. If the flower or the bee is going for hours of light or temperature versus temperature, there can be a mismatch there. The other thing is the non-bumbles are going to have certain physical characteristics that make them more successful on certain species versus maybe the species that the bumbles are successful on.
Yeah.
And one more comment in terms of time of day when certain flowers are visited. Flowers can have a certain time of day when they're more likely to have food to offer. And that could be even if the flower is going to persist throughout the day. But then there are lots of flowers who might come out early in the morning, for instance. And then as it heats up, the flower lasts less than a day and can start withering. So I think that whole area is a very complex area.
Absolutely. Those are great points. I appreciate you bringing that up because with the question of like, do other bees visit these plants? There's so many angles. Like, there's probably some specialist plants on that list, but many specialist plants not on that list. And then some specialist bees are visiting their specialist plants that are on that list. But of course, the ones that their plants not on there are not visiting it. Yeah, I would love to have like a very long discussion just about all of these things with all the plant people, because I think there's so much to talk about. But those are really great points. Thank you for bringing that up.
There is a wonderful Ohio State, their recorded webinars, 6 sessions on bumbles.
The last one is me.
Ah.
Well, it's mostly Sam, and then it's that's the webinar where I walk through how to survey. It's the Ohio State short course on bumblebees.
Yes.
Is excellent. And the first couple episodes are from Jamie Strange. He knows everything about bumblebees. That is that's an awesome resource. Thank you for bringing that up.
Well, I think this has been really terrific. Thank you very
you.
much.
Jean said that if flowers are too narrow for carpenters or bumbles to enter, they will bite into the base of the flower to get nectar, which of course bypasses the pollination process, but that's how they get it apparently in some of those. Carol says queen bumblebees do have some spring specificity. She's read that they are the only one big enough to force open Dutchman's breeches, and it's an important source of pollen early when they're building their nest.
Huh. That's interesting. I don't know what that plant is. So
Another large plant that has to be pollinated by bumbles is closed gentians, and there's that name was just, the genus was just changed recently, but the old one was, I think, Gentiana clausa, for instance, is one of the ones.
okay, something to look into. Thank you.
Because the flowers don't open.
Oh, wow. So it's not a buzz pollination thing, it's just sheer force. Wow, that's amazing. Huh.
And then one more thing from earlier in the presentation, we have a comment that the visuals are stupendous and the best that Karen Brown has ever seen.
Thank you so much. And I should plug, all of these pictures are from the Bee Lab, which Sam works at and I run this project out of. They take all of them. It's they're stacked images. So they have a basic Canon camera, but it's on a track and it takes maybe 80 to 200 pictures, each focused slightly farther, and stacks all of the images. And then there's a little bit of touch up to remove dust and stuff, but all of the colors are as they are.
I think that they're on Flickr.
Yes, and they're all free, open source. Do anything with them. They don't even want you to ask. They don't want credit. And they make a nice presentation, in my opinion.
So I'm going to assume, sadly, that bumblebees are in decline like all the other critters out there. Like, what's the trajectory generally since, let's do the 1970 data points, since that's what Ptolemy uses for his birds. Sense of that?
I think that it's hard to say at a genus level. Some of them, a lot of bumblebees that are suffering due to other bumblebees invading. So for example, like Bombus dalbomii, which my master's thesis, that one is critically endangered. And it is because of introduced European bumblebees, which brought in disease. So those ones are doing fine, but then, you know, some of the native ones are not. And that's a similar story with impatiens, which is the only endangered bumblebee. And I think the only endangered bee in the US, but I would fact check that. Definitely the only endangered bumblebee according to who does the endangered species lists. So yeah, definitely some species are not doing well. As a whole, I wouldn't totally say that they're in decline, but I think, you know, as land use changes and climate change progresses, things are becoming imperiled as, you know, phenology changes and all these things could imminently, I think, be pretty devastating to most. But bumblebees are a little bit lucky because they're generalists, so specialists, it's a harder time to align with your plant that you specialize on. And then also bumblebees, they can handle cold temperatures really well because they're so big and fuzzy. So that's at least one type of buffer to climate change, which maybe will help them. But yeah, I wouldn't say as a broad statement they're declining. Some definitely are. And I do think that it's important that we provide habitat for them to prevent decline.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it with that and I'll stand up here. Thank you so much. This was really wonderful.
Thank you for having me. This has been amazing. Oh,
Yes,
thank
please.
you.
The audience out there is clapping too, and
Thank
I've
you
seen
all.
little chats popping up. Wonderful presentation, a lot of people. So
Oh,
thank you
thank
again.
you so much.
I think this is an example of one of our grantees, and you can see what amazing work goes on and all the follow-up from that, right? So not just the work, but then there's all the things that come after that. So that's really great. We're really glad to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for your support.